Oh,
So you didn't get it.
I did not. Sorry.
Not that I have ever played Dungeons. Okay. I have never played that. For nerds.
Cool. So our objective for today, we will discuss the philosophies behind the origins of the prison system and the concept of abandonment and how the concept of abandonment plays into the prison system. So that word abandonment, just keep that in mind while we're listening to the podcast, because that's going to be one of the bigger themes. And then we're just going to play through the whole podcast, and then by the end of the podcast, we'll have a full discussion. For just to keep in mind, like for future meetings as well, raise your hand. For one of two things. One, you like to listen to the whole thing and then discuss afterwards, or two, you like to discuss piece by piece. So raise your hand if you like to discuss something after the whole thing is ended.
I have a pre-question to that. How long is the podcast?
This one is 50 minutes.
Okay.
So raise your hand if you like to listen to the whole thing and then discuss after.
I have a question.
Yes.
Do you have any points that you wanted to make during the podcast that you want to discuss? Because if you have it like that, like we did last week, I prefer that. Where you ever got like.
That's why we had us
Okay.
raising our hands to vote. Right.
No, so for today, I have it more so like we discussed afterwards, but we could like choose stopping points throughout the podcast, but
Well, he has a point, like, I like listening to it all the way through, but if you have like specific parts that you wanna point out,
oh, I see.
then like that's cool.
Yeah.
Okay. For today, I just have it to discuss at the end.
Okay.
But I could like find more, like all these things that we discussed at the end could be pieced in and out. So
I think for me, I do like kind of stopping here and there because when I can hear other people talk about what they're getting out of it, it helps me pay attention to different aspects and open my mind to different things that I might be missing. Versus if I wait till the end, then I have to like go back and rewatch it to catch some of those things.
yeah. Okay. All right. So let's do the group vote real quick. Raise your hand if you like discussing at the end after listening to the whole thing. And raise your hand if you like piece by piece.
I like both.
Okay. So for today, it's going to be a little bit more whole thing and then discuss at the end. And then in the future, it will be that. But if there are stopping points where it seems like I'm not cutting off the main idea, then I will bring it to discussion questions. Okay. Any questions before we get started?
Whoa.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cat like reflexes.
You won't gotta heat the water. Never the sky. He coming early morning. Never the sky. He go by man and neck. Never the sky. We're gonna go home to play. Never the
The things that set in motion the events that resulted in Mr. Floyd's brutal murder was that an employee at a convenience store thought that they had been handed a counterfeit bill. This young person, I assume is young, who's probably making minimum wage, who works for somebody who I understand to be a very decent human being, who hires people in the community, a Palestinian American convenience store owner, did their job to keep their job. But we have to ask ourselves, why could it be they take this suspect looking bill, complete the transaction, and then deal with it afterward, right? They had been deputized. Why is somebody working in a convenience store a deputy cop? This is a question.
Okay, that is actually a good place to start. That was one of the questions. What do y'all think about that claim that like this person who works at a convenience store is a deputized cop and part of that policing system right there? Because I would never look at someone at a convenience store and cashier and think, oh, you're part of the policing system. So just like, what are some initial thoughts about that? And then also like, can you see this play out in other areas of society as well?
I can see yes and no. The no part because it's like, even though it's their job and everything like that to report this kind of stuff, they didn't expect that cop to do that. You know, like, let's keep it real. We can't be point of blame at that, but at the same time, it's like the deputizing part, I don't think, were they really deputized? Like that?
I don't even know what that means.
So, yeah, it's meant as more of like a theoretical aspect, or this person wasn't like specifically like deputized as part of the police system,
Okay.
but like from like a theoretical or philosophical aspect of it is this person was a part of the branching of the police system by being the person who was not because they wanted to, like they said, like they just were doing what they were told to do. That was their job.
Right.
Like she doesn't believe that the person who called did anything wrong because they didn't, like you said, didn't know what was going to happen.
Right.
But through that system, like that person is already like at the first step of the police. So,
So you're saying that all of us could be that person when we feel emboldened to call the police?
kind of, but this was more like a situation where like part of their training is to call the police.
Oh,
Right.
Versus like the store owner could have had, well, this even is deputizing, could have had like the pins to see is this a counterfeit bill, but even then you're questioning like, are these real bills, and that in itself is a deputizing versus just accepting the money when you turn it into the bank and they say it's counterfeit, then you deal with the aftermath of that kind of thing.
What do you think of any other alternative solutions? So calling the police and saying it's a counterfeit bill.
not me.
I feel like pens that you can check too.
It's $20.
Yeah, security ribbons, right? You look at, so a light through it.
So I handle money, I don't have a job or anything like that. I mean, we have pens or anything like that, and we just take their information and we don't have to drop in half a bill and report it to the proper authorities, but we don't like tearing it up. We're like,
They may not have even known that if it was a counterfeit bill, he may not have even known it was counterfeit.
that's true.
That's what I wonder too, because I've seen a lot of counterfeit bills, like working with money and stuff, and I'm like, if I had that, I would think it was real, and I would just go spend it, and no one would question me because I'm a white lady using that money. I don't know, the person who took the money could have just not been a dick, and not, I don't know, there's a lot of times where you have a job and it's about like keeping the store, like having revenue and stuff, but also you don't have to be such a stickler prick. You don't have to do that. Like there's a lot of times I know when I worked in retail where I just was like, it's not that serious to me. Like I'm not gonna tackle someone who's stealing. I don't care that much. Like it's not my money. They have enough money to replace it or whatever. They're probably selling it marked up 90% of what it costs to make it anyway. Like I don't know, it's never that serious to me, but I don't know.
I was thinking you asked like, are there other aspects that you can think of? And I think of it in my field, like I worked in an inpatient hospital for like 4 years before I came here, and then learning about the inpatient hospitals here, and there's a huge difference in the way that we address like an issue. So if I have a patient back home that had a warrant for that, you know, was destroying the property in the hospital, our philosophy was like, so what? They're not here for that. Like, they're not hurting anything. Property can be replaced. We don't care. Destroy the whole unit. We'll move everybody so you can do that. When you're calm, we'll address you then. Whereas here, I see people, the hospitals, you're in a psych hospital for psych reasons, and the psych hospital calls the police on you and has them come arrest you from the psych hospital and take you to jail. Like, that's another form of that. I think it's stupid to me.
Yeah, so that's a concept just to kind of think about and like keep in the forefront of your mind throughout the podcast is that idea of how ingrained like the idea of the police are in society, where even someone whose job is totally unrelated to law enforcement in a way is still that first step.
Convenience store, a deputy cop. This is a question.
This is Intercepted. I'm Chenjerai Kumanika. I'm an assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Rutgers University, I'm the co-host and creator of the Uncivil podcast, coming to you from my home in Philadelphia. I'm taking over the show from Jeremy Scahill for this week, and this is episode 134 of Intercepted.
So many public agencies, education, healthcare, and so forth, have absorbed policing functions, where at the same time, many of the agencies of organized violence, such as jails and prisons and police, are absorbing social work functions, mental health care functions, things that they actually can't do.
That's our guest, geographer and prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore. In part one of our two-part conversation, we speak about police killings, the Black Lives Matter movement, and abolition organizing as police brutality in America has inspired a national uprising with global solidarity. As cases of COVID-19 continue to escalate, people across our entire country, from rural towns to major cities, are retaking the streets to rebel. Police and National Guard forces have responded with even more violence. The killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis cops was another horrific and needless death, another unarmed Black man killed by police and recorded for all the world to see. It was another spectacle of violence at the hands of the state. And we've seen this before, like literally, we've seen it. Black men choked by police in broad daylight, uprisings against the carceral state, police, and prisons, and pictures that prove that torture is going on in the institutions of criminal punishment. And we see the police are mostly not held accountable. They don't get fired. They don't get charged. And in the few cases where they do get charged, it's extremely rare for them to be convicted. But what is right before our eyes and on our cameras is not the entire picture of the change that needs to happen. If we look off camera and back just a little bit into history, we can see the conclusive failure of the kinds of reforms that established Democrats are proposing right now. Yes, use of force legislation is crucial, but remember, a judge found Officer Pantaleo guilty of using a banned chokehold when he killed Eric Garner. Pantaleo is free today. Also, as African American Studies professor Naomi Murakawa has pointed out, the concept of community policing was at the heart of the two largest crime reform legislative efforts of the 20th century. The first one was sponsored by Lyndon B. Johnson, the 1968 Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Street Act, which created the Law Enforcement Administration. What that resulted in? $10 billion was doled out to police departments, often in the name of improving police and community relations. This didn't mean treating people differently. It meant taxpayer money was spent on police public relations campaigns. The second major criminal reform effort was the Clintons' 1994 crime bill. This established the Office of Community-Oriented Police Services within the Justice Department. And what did that result in? $9 billion given to police departments over 6 years. And yet, here we are. What we have to grapple with is this. These images are showing us a violence that's so clear that we've stopped being able to see beyond it. The spectacle of violence is only the tip of the spear. It's only the most acute manifestation of 150 years of racist state violence, punishing the poor, and failed reform. More training workshops for cops or another Black police chief is not going to fix this. Cops who kneel with protesters and then stand up and tear gas them is not going to fix this. What would it look like to try something else? To defund and dismantle police departments. And yes, to abolish the police. What?
That was a pretty hefty section, I think, especially because of the reform argument is a huge one. So it's hard to ask like a specific question because there is so much there. So first, let's just talk to someone next to us about like what are your initial thoughts from hearing all of that? What struck you the most in that little passage about what was said? You can do 2 minutes, 1 minute for each person to talk. What's it?
To add on to that, yes, other being like mental aspects, things like that, how systematic, police procedure to identify tasks that are, it's, so yeah, it just, I think that's continuing.
Yeah.
Go ahead and switch if you haven't already.
I think it's
So that we're being
at the end of the day, we really want to solve the issue of they were on the same issue. And they need let people have access to resources. They just have social programs. Yeah, exactly. It doesn't really matter. And it's more about like the part about the start testers and stuff on the edge that he said.
Let's bring it back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Does anybody like to share their initial thoughts? Something that struck them in that passage? It's okay. Okay. What do we think about reform? That idea of reform. Is there anything that struck you about that? Especially when saying that the type of reform that's being mentioned by Democrats right now, or within the last few weeks, about how to reform the police. What do we think about those types of arguments?
Me personally, I think that should have happened a long time ago, especially since until and the key lines. That should have happened a long time ago. And the conversations they had back then, it's like the guy told us, it's like even when they put in these bills that we can rise to the surface, in reality, it was actually going against us, like using our own money to fund the assholes to attack us and not change.
I think it's interesting too, like the money that's being put in, even if it is like for community engagement. It's like it was said, it's not really having cops treating people differently.
It's a political standpoint to make it look better.
Yeah, definitely.
That's what I'm saying with Lauren is that I think most of it is like a PR thing more than an actual wanting to fix the issues at hand. Like if our country and our state governments wanted to fix crime, they know how to fix crime. Like let people have access to resources. It's very simple, but that's not the issue at hand. They don't. It's not like the priority, at least. Like no matter what they say, like oh, tough on crime, this and that. It's like you're not solving the issue where it's actually stemming from. You're just putting a Band-Aid that looks nice and cute, like wrapping up dog shit. It's not gonna do anything. Looks nice. Smells awful.
It's also like was said that the violence by police is the tip of the iceberg, and that's what we tend to focus on, which as we should, right? It's awful, the things that we see on video, hear about, but even that, like that's the stuff that gets the most coverage. But you know, on a day where we're not seeing a video of a police brutality incident that happened the day before, there's still other things going on that are below the surface of that iceberg that we don't think about and we don't hear about, because it is a whole system, and then that system is just showing itself more when there's police violence and police terrorism that are involved in it.
I think that if you solve the issue of poverty, that would eliminate like 50-ish% of all of the problems that we deal with today. Like if everyone, I mean, as we said before, like the liberation of Black people will liberate all of us as a whole.
Also, to add on to the point, something that brought it up is not only help with poverty or anything like that, but the reason why black on black crime is such huge stats is because all the policing are focused on black communities
Yeah.
and Mexican communities. So if we take those out, the stats will go low, help with the resources, and everything will thrive and flourish.
Yeah, and those points are brought up in the podcast. So are there any other thoughts? All right, great transition then. Thanks.
What would it look like to try something else? To defund and dismantle police departments? And yes, to abolish the police. What would it look like to abolish prisons? And when I say abolish, what do I mean? At this incendiary moment of crisis and possibility, we are deeply honored to hear from an experienced organizer and tremendous thinker on prisons, police, and how these systems of violence organize our lives and what we must do about it. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, professor of geography and director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics at the CUNY Graduate Center, is co-founder of several abolitionist organizations, including Critical Resistance. She's author of the prize-winning book, Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California. She's also finishing a couple of new books, including Change Everything, Racial Capitalism and the Case for Abolition, forthcoming Haymarket. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, welcome to Intercepted.
Thanks for having me on today. I'm glad to be here.
Ruth Wilson Gilmore shared a broad range of her thinking on the issues we are facing right now. But the first thing I was curious about was where she came from and who she was before she came to prison abolition.
Ruthie was and continues to be the child and grandchild and probably multiple generations of freedom fighters. We are Black people of the North. I grew up in a working class household. My father was a tool and die maker. My mother worked as a lab technician. My father's father was a janitor and a steward for a fraternity at Yale. My father's mother was a seamstress and took laundry into her house. My other grandmother cleaned white people's houses. This is like where I came from. Everybody, every generation I know about fought for freedom. What was the freedom we fought for? My grandfather was one of the people who helped to organize the first blue-collar union at an Ivy League school. This was during World War II, the double victory. Victory against fascism abroad, victory against Jim Crow at home. My father organized the machinists at Winchester's repeating firearms factory in the mid-1950s. Again, a labor struggle. He was also a leader in organizing for the well-being of the Black community of New Haven, and in so doing, made certain that all kinds of people's lives would get better. So he was somebody who, long before Black Lives Matter, saw that when Black Lives Matter, everybody lives better. And he's kind of known in my hometown to this day. Tool and die maker became quite a fighter for freedom. So that's who Ruthie was. I was raised by these people in this tradition, born 70 years ago, so in the waning years of Jim Crow in 1950. So I came to an anti-capitalist position quite young, and I never left that. I learned from reading and studying with people like Cedric Robinson, Stuart Hall, Angela Davis, Claudia Jones, so many people from around the world, how it is that we can make freedom out of what we have, not by yielding or sacrificing some of our comrades, but by trying to live the principle where life is precious, life is precious.
Like so many other people, I opened Ruthie's 2007 book, Golden Gulag, looking to understand why prisons and policing have become the answer to so many of society's problems, and why now. But in the book's first pages, Ruthie gives us the image of a bus filled with people pulling onto a road.
First of all, I'm a geographer. That is my discipline. And it might be interesting to listeners to understand that geographers don't make maps. Rather, we ask ourselves, Why do things happen where they do? Why do things happen where they do? What I did in figuring out how to frame or introduce my book was to give the readers a sense of the expansive ground on which the prison industrial complex rose. To give the readers an understanding that there are urban and rural dimensions to it, to give the readers an understanding that there is a constant shift in the kinds of relationships people have with each other, with the means of production, with where they can and can't be in the world, and also how to struggle. And finally, I used that metaphor so that we could see, riding with those people in the bus, that there were so many different points of entry for various people to fight against the abandonment that had resulted in, among other things, mass incarceration, but also austerity, outsourcing, underemployment, environmental degradation, and the capture of the state government by those who are only ever enhancing the ability of the well-to-do to get richer.
In the book, Ruthie describes the people on the bus as a dream crowd, dream riders, whose different entry points into struggle had to do with race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, and religion, but they were drawn together by their sameness. As Ruthie puts it, they were employed, disabled, or retired working people with little or no discretionary income, whose goal was freedom for their relatives serving long sentences behind bars. This struck me as so much more sophisticated than some of our mainstream discussions about who has a stake in this fight and why.
My friend, the fantastic historian Daryl Scott, always warns against trying to summon outrage and political consciousness through appeals that result in pity or contempt. Instead, what we can see in following the story in my book and the empirical data that I used to make that book happen and the ethnographic information that I managed to put together by working with people closely on the ground is this. As the Black Lives Matter people said so poignantly some years ago in the last uprisings, when Black Lives Matter, everybody lives better. Now that's different from saying only Black people know what this suffering is. Rather, what we see in police killings, for example, in the United States, is that behind the sturdy curtain of racism that makes killing after killing after killing of Black people newsworthy, noteworthy, and yet not change anything, the police are killing lots of other people too. If we can stop the police from killing Black people, other people won't be killed, because that's the killing that's so acceptable, continually is justified, and argued off as something police had no choice but to do. So in my book, and in
Let's just take a minute, do another turn and share with your partner. Do you agree with that? Do you think that that captures the issue in the most holistic way, or do you think that there's more to it than that? In the claim that if we stop the killing of Black people by police, then that allows for us to end violence in other ways, because the police killings of Black people are often justified by society. So in a logical perspective, it's if we stop that justification, then we stop the justification for further violence as well. And that also ties in with the idea, like was mentioned earlier, that if Black Lives Matter, then it allows other Black people to live better as well. So do you agree with that? Do you think that's a good way to summarize the issue, or would you feel that there's more to it than that? Go ahead and share with your partner for a minute. We take 30 seconds to switch it up.
I think it should simply summarize the issue. I think some evidence is really not but I think that there's other issues that would further,
Yeah, I agree.
that would alleviate all of the issues that are facing, that Black people are facing. Like that matters, but that could come with other solutions, eliminating poverty, and it would have the, I think, eliminating poverty and potentially have some of the same factors going to be used in reality. What do you think?
I mean, I
I'm also not an expert, she sounds like an expert, so I'm allowed to do everything.
for me, hearing it, I think
Bring back together in about 5, 4,
I know.
3, 2, 1. Does anybody like to share, full group, their thoughts on that? Again, there's no agenda with this question. A lot of this is just discussion based. So I mean, don't worry about saying the right or wrong answer.
Everyone would agree that that's like, I think everyone's on the same boat, but.
yeah, I think we all agree, because like once the systematic racism against Black people stops, like once people stop being killed, Asians will stop being killed, you know. It's like, because what we're fighting for in the Black Lives Matter movement is going for everybody, not my purpose.
I think it's a good summary of it as well. To say that, especially because it is something that is so, like police terrorism is so highlighted in the media. If we can start there and then boil it down from there, and then we could actually make a difference. And then I also like the idea of solidarity that's mentioned. Of everyone's on the bus with a common interest, and I think that's something that's often forgotten. And like we see that people get upset at the Black Lives Matter movement because they feel that it doesn't include them, but the movement is trying to say that we're all on the same bus. And if we focus on these issues, then it will allow for everyone on that bus to have a better way of living.
So in my book and in the research that I did and in the political work that I have done in California, around the United States, and also internationally, I find that people can take from the multiple struggles that come together against police brutality, against police killings, against mass incarceration, against austerity, and imagine for themselves through their work how the struggle is class struggle. Always, always, always.
The knee-jerk rejection of the concept of police and prison abolition by most mainstream politicians is based on the totally uninformed idea that what abolitionists are recommending is simply removing the police, decarcerating, and letting the chips fall where they may. Of course, this is an incorrect and reductionist description. Instead, abolitionists have been the main ones calling attention to the relentless new investment in police and prisons. U.S. Attorney General William Barr recently commented that he thinks calls to defund the police and reduce police budgets are, quote unquote, dangerous. I asked Ruthie to talk about some of the weaknesses of the most popular explanations for the relentless expansion of the carceral state.
The first weakness is the one that says, well, the reason there are so many people in prison is crime. Do I, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, say there aren't people who harm other people or people who engage in reprehensible acts? Of course I don't. I'm not a fool. I, like many abolitionists, came to abolition because we were tired of harm and we wanted to see something else happening in our communities and in the world. We didn't come idealistically thinking that there was no such thing as harm. Rather, we looked at the political category of crime and wanted to take it apart. The main reason that abolitionists in the movement don't use the word crime in a straightforward way is that it's not a straightforward category. What gets lumped into that word, and certainly what appears in the front of people's minds in their everyday common sense, people who are listening to us talk are immediately rushing to understand is, why are they talking as though people don't hurt and rob other people? That's what people think crime is. So one question that we abolitionists ask ourselves is, what are the conditions under which it is more likely that people will resort to using violence? And
I'll replay that question when we start back up. I just want to start with that idea of crime, and like you said, abolitionists have an issue with using the word crime. What do you think of when you hear the word crime? What crimes come to mind? Homicide?
Yeah, I think like brutal stuff.
Violent crimes.
Yeah.
Okay, so on the same page that crime, was that
Robbery.
robbery? Okay. Okay, so we have like violent crimes, right? And then what was that last one?
Double parking your car.
Right. So that's
Driving a
specific
truck.
crime. What's that?
Nothing.
You can throw shade elsewhere. Yeah, so we have homicide, and then we have double parking your car. And then
Equal
we,
punishment.
what's that?
I call for equal punishment of
Okay.
all crimes.
I think you made your other classes. That idea too.
I just kidding. Go on.
I also see crime as like an umbrella term that people who are against our movement like to use that. Like for instance, like they're like we all listed that there's a bunch of crimes out there. But the thing is though, it's like the people who are mostly incarcerated and have felonies for us for petty crimes for a lot of stuff that's legal for today. Like there's people serving times for selling marijuana when you can go down the street and get it yourself. They're incarcerated. And I'm glad they brought up William Barr because that guy, the only reason why he's against that, in my personal opinion, is because if we release the people who are mass incarcerated for petty crimes like that, those are the same people who still be able to vote and you get him out of there.
Yeah.
That's the reason why he's on.
I think it's kind of insane how, you know, if you have so many like tickets, like say you have a lot of parking tickets or something and you don't pay it, then they can put a warrant out for your arrest. Like, to me, like that's not really like a crime because, you know, people can't be paying all these things. And then that goes, other people are like, well, they should park somewhere else, you know, stuff like that. And that to me is really dumb.
I think also remembering that what is considered a crime depends on who you are. So if you're in a position of power, you can do whatever you want basically, and it's not a crime. You're not punished. It's not even considered a crime, so there's no punishment for it. Versus if the average person were to do it, or if a person of color were to do it, then it is a huge crime, and it's almost considered a violent crime.
There's that saying that if it's punishable by fine, like pay money, then it's legal for rich people to do. Which I believe that's like basically how our system works. Like you could speed like go 100 on the freeway here. Normal people getting a ticket for that would hurt your pockets, you know, but like a rich person, it's like, cool, it was worth it. I'll do it again next week. Like, what are they going to do to me?
Yeah.
And they can afford like the best lawyers to get them out of trouble. And
moving up parking tickets.
yeah, and get it. Yeah, exactly. Like most things that you get tickets from, if you have the money to get a lawyer, they can knock it down or even make it so it doesn't go on your record. But most people don't have money for a lawyer. Casually, just buy a lawyer, no big deal.
That was John Oliver, I think was the one that read an article, but there was a picture of Tucker Carlson with a picture of like,
Your favorite.
the headline was like, criminals in Portland destroying the town, and it was like a list of all the crimes that they did, and like 9 of them out of 10 were like graffiti here, graffiti, graffiti, graffiti,
Oh,
graffiti.
yeah.
But it's like, okay, is graffiti really on the same level of needing to bring in the Department of Homeland Security? And so like there's so much nuance to the term crime, and so for us to use it as like a blanket term is harmful to the movement, which I think a lot of people know that on the side who are against the movement, because they pin people as criminals, even though the people who are doing the pinning are the same ones who, with their power, are probably committing crimes in the same way, whether it be getting inside information on the stock market like senators did, or embezzlement, things like that, exploitation of labor, which is illegal. So things like that. There's so much nuance to stuff that we're not considering, and so by just saying like, oh well, putting all crime under the same blanket and giving it all the same solution, which is prison or jail or police intervention, that's not accounting for the nuance and the different contexts that exist in every single situation. So that's something that abolitionists are huge on, is saying that we can't just pin this all into one umbrella, and we need to reconsider how we view it, how we talk about it. Because when we talk about it with people as well who are against the movement, it's important to use the right phrasing, that way they can understand, no, it's not as simple as just pull police out and all crime and just run free. Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I feel like when I talk about crime, I usually try and use like the term violent crime, aside from crimes that are based on like capital, like destruction of property, graffiti, stealing, grand larceny, all those things are like money, versus violent crimes are committed acts, things that are committed against individuals. And I think there's a huge difference between those two things. Like, and people don't really think of it that way. It's like, did they steal $2,500 worth of stuff, or did they beat up an old person? I don't think those are the same, and I don't think you should be in prison for longer than somebody that does like a violent act against someone. I mean, I don't know. Anyways, I don't know what's gonna happen after the prison. That's what I want to learn more about, is what is next.
Yeah.
When do abolitionists believe that people who commit violent crimes like rape, murder, so on and so forth, do those people have a place in prison? Do any prisons exist? I don't know. That is a serious question.
Yeah, no, that's something that we'll keep in mind over the next few weeks. That's something to discuss as well. This is more the theory behind like prisons and why they exist, and how they've come to become so natural to us, and then from there on forward. But yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, I also love that like you said, you try to use the term violent crime. And I think it's important to check other people on that as well, especially when they say like, oh well, these protesters are committing crimes. It's like, okay, well, what do you view that as?
Or
So,
he has a criminal record. Like,
Right.
It's like, I have a criminal record and I'm a state employee. They didn't care if I have a criminal record.
Mhm.
I got caught with a gram of weed when I was 18, like 3 months before it was legal. And it's just like, I have a criminal record for that. I'm not a criminal.
Right.
And the word criminal has such a negative connotation where now I just have to start saying, I'm a thug.
Represent
nothing. I'm embarrassing. Sorry, keep going.
No, but yeah, that also ties into like the point that Sierra brought up, is that labeling people as felons, like not only is that
Yeah.
a label, but like now you have, well, you committed a felony, so you automatically can't vote, and so
Right.
that
And
issue right
that's a
there.
stab at
How is that?
self-esteem.
Well, yeah, and it's like, how is that even constitutional? That's something that I cannot get over. The fact that we take away people who commit crimes' right to vote does not add up to me at all. But in the same breath, we allow people who have domestic violence past, like proven domestic violence, be cops, whatever. I mean, it's not a big deal. Who cares? They can carry a gun. No big deal. No one cares about that. But felons can't vote, even if they've changed their life without spending a whole bunch of money to pay a lawyer to get their record expunged.
And to add on to that, it is so easy to become a felon in the United States of America.
And the 3 strikes you're out. What's that about, California? What's up, Bill Clinton? Sorry.
It kind of, like, looking at crimes the same way kind of reminds me of, this is probably kind of out of pocket, but it reminds me of like the Catholic religion, like in terms of, asking for forgiveness and stuff. And it's like, oh, like you murder 10 people, but you ask for forgiveness, like you committed to your sin, like will be looked at the same way as like stealing a loaf of bread for your family.
That's true.
Yeah.
Do you think that Western Christian values has a huge influence on our punitive system that we have today? I think so too.
I was like, I don't have a degree in religion or
I have a degree in everything.
Is what are the conditions under which it is more likely that people will resort to using violence and harm to solve problems? This is a question we ask ourselves. What can we do about it so that there is less harm? And one thing that we have learned is that where life is precious, life is precious. So there are all kinds of people throughout the abolitionist world in the United States and beyond who, for example, have tried to figure out how to reduce, if not completely do away with, the kinds of relationships that make people vulnerable to interpersonal violence, particularly of the domestic or intimate sort. So there is huge amount of work on that. And I don't mean work that people have written up in esoteric academic journals. I mean the work that people do on the ground every day to keep themselves and their communities safe and well. Two, the kinds of responses that the criminal system has put into effect over the last 40 years approximately has been to lengthen and lengthen and lengthen sentences, even though there's no evidence that a long sentence for one person who has committed some harm interrupts another person from committing some harm, right? The only thing that we know seems to be the case is when the person who gets a long sentence is locked up, they're not committing another harm on the outside. We don't know what they're doing on the inside, but they're not committing another harm on the outside. That's a wordy way of saying the purpose of locking people up today has pretty much been incapacitation. You're locked up, you can't do what you were doing.
Another
Okay, I just wanted to put like a big star on that. Like you said, there's no evidence that increasing sentence lengths will actually cause a prevention to crime. It's not a deterrent.
Not a deterrent.
No one's going to be on the street going, oh, well, they just upped that to 10 years, so I'm going to make sure I don't do this. It doesn't work like that. There was also there was an article that I was reading about how the same person, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, mentioned how in Spain, the not maximum, but typical prison sentence is 7 years. And Spain has a much lower record of violence than we do in the United States. So that's just another testament to how longer prison sentences don't make a difference. And so for us here in the US, there's no really strong science behind it besides, well, get them out of sight because we don't want to deal with them. And so as long as we can lock them up, then they're not out here and we don't have to worry about the problem. It's all hiding the problem instead of dealing with it.
to look critically at how the carceral state defines crime is the irrationality of the solutions that it presents us with. Woothie says that incapacitation is one of 4 ways we are told that prisons will produce stability in our society. The other ways are through rehabilitation, deterrence, or retribution. But there's also another way that these systems of organized violence colonize more and more of our lives.
More and more kinds of behavior, some of it antisocial, some of it not, has been criminalized over time. So there have been new crimes added to the books, as well as extended sentences and sentence enhancements, that is to say, a sentence on top of a sentence for already existing wrongdoing. So you put all of that together, and then you can see how it is that in the United States, crime went up, crime went down, but then they cracked down. That the rise in prison lags behind the rise and fall of crime. That's another reason we don't talk about crime as much. What we're trying to do is get people to understand the kinds of relationships that have normalized a sense that what prisons do is natural, normal, and inevitable.
One way to dig even deeper into the category and meaning of crime is to look at it historically. When I asked Ruthie about this, she told me about a place in New Jersey.
In fact, in the late 18th century, one of the first prisons built in the United States, the one in Trenton, the oldest one in downtown Trenton, New Jersey, has etched in stone above the door that those who are feared for their crime may learn fear of the law and be useful.
One of the earliest American prisons claimed that it incarcerated people to make sure they were useful. But what did it mean to be useful for the masses of working people in the 18th century United States? To understand this, Ruthie takes us away from the United States.
So the middle of the 18th century is a time when in England, but not necessarily between and among English people, all kinds of workers were becoming disciplined to the wage. What does that mean? And this is what I learned from the fabulous historian Peter Linebaugh. What it means is that up until this time, workers' compensation took the form of a mix of things. They would get some money pay, the wage, but also they could get some of the stuff that they were working with. So, for example, a stevedore who took barrels of tobacco off a ship that had just arrived from the other side of the Atlantic could put the barrel down on the wharf, pry it open, take a handful of tobacco, put it in his pocket, and that would be part of his pay. That became outlawed because what the owners wanted to do was to make all workers accept only the money wage they got without any other kind of compensation. So then that meant also that people who worked building buildings could no longer take the bits of wood that they had sawed off home to do something else, whether it was warm their house or make something. Or people who worked making clothing in sewing shops couldn't take the remnants of fabric that they cut off the thing that they were making home to make their own things. The disciplining of those people to the wage was enforced by using the death penalty against the theft that they were convicted of. Theft of the tobacco, theft of the remnants of fabric. So Linebaugh, in his fabulous book, The London Hanged, tells this story. So we come up to the 19th century in the American Project, and we can use the kind of thinking that, even Michel Foucault offered to us when he talked about how surveillance and punishment were key to the institutional infrastructure of control for what he called a society of strangers on the move. A society of strangers on the move. So there is a disciplining intention to prison. In the early days, sentences tended to be very short, as were lives. And we also know, if we follow very carefully, that unfree people were very rarely locked up. Unfree people who existed for their labor to be exploited, that is to say, African descended chattel slaves, were rarely locked up because it was not useful for those who owned the fruits of their labor to have them locked away. So prisons were for free people, generally white people, usually people who would check the box, male if they had to check a box. In
just for a minute, 30 seconds each. What do you take from that section about the connection between a person and their labor and the concept of usefulness? What do you take from all that?
I see slavery. Part of it is that it's like, oh, you have you're gonna make consultants out of you.
I think that it's very clear in this country
Yeah, it's like
for years that
Yeah, like,
we don't value human life over capital. Yeah, literally.
It's like, it's like, or it's like, it's like really qualifications that something you need.
Go ahead and switch if you have it.
You have really great customer service, you have 2 years of experience.
Yeah.
Even though you can offer something, they don't teach you.
Right.
I just think it's like, oh, you're not looking at human. It's like, well, where you would at what you do, but
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes especially in like now, like
Let's bring it back together in 5, 4, 3. Is there anybody that wanted to share some of their takeaways for full group?
I think what prisons do now is just modern day slavery. Because they're like, oh, we have your hands now, like you're gonna do this for us instead, but we're not gonna pay you for it, because basically you still owe us time.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's right. And the skills that they say that they're making useful for is absolute bull crap, because the stuff that they're making them do is so repetitive, and like factory work, and like most factory jobs are down, low income jobs are up. And most of the skills that they need is like internet and technical skills, and they're not offering that in prison. So basically, they're similar to failure on their release.
In fact, they take out all the education options in prison. You can't get a degree anymore.
Exactly, because the felon part.
I think that our country has a long, long history of valuing money over people and like what you can do. I think that's what led to today, how we strongly identify our self-worth with our ability to gain income or like what our job is. And I feel like that's why I think our generation is kind of shifting away from that. And like with the mental health thing, like you can call off and not feel bad if you really are having a hard mental health day. That's okay. Because I know myself personally, I feel extremely guilty when I call off and weird about it. But then I think, why do I care? I have paid time off. Why can't I use it? Why should I feel bad about using it? But I think most people feel that way because we've been programmed to think that our only important thing in our society is to contribute with capitalism.
And Ruth Wilson Gilmore does like mention capitalism at the beginning and is kind of pushing against it here by saying that capitalism is responsible for the separation of a person from their labor. And your person doesn't matter, it's only what you can produce. And it's striking that in that prison, like it's written there, right there that says we're going to make a person who follows the law and is useful to us. And so that's kind of how people are viewed by the government and by people in power. And so that's gives them more reason to exploit people because they don't see people, they don't see humans, they see products of and that contribute labor.
That point to like what you were saying earlier, the idea that people in prisons are like it's modern day slavery, it's obvious. And then a lot of people like we think, well, why is that? Like why does it exist? Why is it okay? And it's like because once we put the stamp of criminal on someone, then we're like, oh, okay, it's just those people, like that other group of people who obviously deserve it because they did something wrong. So whatever they have to do in prison is like their own thing and that's their punishment and they deserve it versus having humanity, I guess. I don't know.
Yep.
What the adverse is here. So,
Yeah, it's easier to justify crime or justify exploitation if you can dehumanize the group that you're trying to do that against.
People who would check the box, male if they had to check a box. In the latter part of the 19th century, in the wake of the Civil War, as we know, prison expanded and rationalized in a number of ways. In the South, we know about chain gangs, which were largely, but not exclusively, people of African descent. In the North and the South, both, all kinds of prisons grew up around and through these struggles over wage, over the right to live, the right to stay still, the right to move around. These were all contributing factors to the expansion and rationalization of prison in the United States. So that at the end of the 19th century, under the capital P progressive movement, we saw institutions arising that regularized prisons for men, prisons for children, women, things that hadn't existed quite so starkly before, as part of the expansion of large-scale governmental institutions that were designed by progressive era people to guarantee the ability to extract value from labor and land. Right? That's kind of what the progressive era was all about, in my view. So Khalil Muhammad has written about this, Estelle Freeman, a lot of people have written fantastically about the distinctions and the differentiations that shaped the progressive era. Nayan Shah, so many people have written really fine work.
Let's be clear. Police and other systems of organized violence do not arise out of any concern for public safety. Instead, these institutions became fixtures in our society so that the powerful could guarantee their right to exploit labor and enforce social hierarchy as modern society became more complex. But Ruthie says we can't fully understand why so many people are in cages today without also exploring the geography of divestment.
In the United States, where organized abandonment has happened throughout the country in urban and rural contexts for more than 40 years, we see that as people have lost the ability to keep their individual selves, their households, and their communities together with adequate income, clean water, reasonable air, reliable shelter, and transportation and communication infrastructure, as those things have gone away, what's risen up in the crevices of this cracked foundation of security has been policing and prison. Now, it's not that surprising when we stop and think that if in an organized way, state and capital abandon people, something is going to arise to shape and direct what those people do who are not absorbed back into the political economy in other ways. It's really not that surprising, though it is frightening. So if we look then,
What do y'all think about using the terms divestment and abandonment to describe reasons for why prisons have become so powerful and why they seem to be solutions to our society's problems? You can talk about that with your groups. Are there any questions about what I mean by that or what was meant by that?
Can you say that again?
Yeah. So what do we think about using the terms divestment and abandonment to describe the current situation that has led to prisons becoming so powerful or becoming the solution? Go ahead and share for a minute, 30 seconds.
I guess, I don't know, I'm concerned where she's going. Was kind of repetitive.
I think it's diversity from the community, basically, and so you need instead of wasting away even the people who aren't. Yeah.
Sure, sure.
Go and switch if you haven't already.
For me, it's like, the abandonment service scenes, like, if you can see this moving on to the abandoned, because it's here, usually about these guys service for potential day. And it's good to do like, it's typically, oh, if you see like this public eye, yeah. Because never put it on nature.
Come back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And anybody want to share their thoughts on the use of those terms? Volunteer yourselves only, please.
I think, were you here?
You know, so I was gonna say,
Okay, I said to her that I think it's accurate to say that we've divested from communities and invested instead in prisons that have no ability to reform or rehabilitate people. So I think divestment, I guess divesting is the right term, but I wasn't sure what the abandonment part meant, so if you could explain that first.
So she says that people have been abandoned by the state and capital.
Oh, okay, yeah. I 100% agree with that because I think I think of a lot of things in terms of like the economy, and over the years now a lot of the jobs that exist are in service positions where it's like customer service positions essentially, like waiters and things like that cannot be eliminated. That's like the majority of like what people, especially like living in Las Vegas, depend on for income. And I think that the government and the state has abandoned us because they haven't made it so that the wages that we work for are a living wage, and therefore when you got a living wage, a lot of people resort to doing crime to supplement the income when the government isn't actually there for you, like welfare. I talk a lot about this because I work for welfare, but you have to make basically no money to qualify to get food stamps or have kids to be able to qualify. And for medical, it just doesn't really make sense. So I think that we have been abandoned because I know when I needed health insurance a few years ago, I was working 2 part-time jobs and going to school full-time, and I didn't qualify for welfare Medicaid during that time. I wasn't making a ton of money, I was barely making it, you know. But that's my personal experience.
I think the term abandonment when it comes to prisons is it's like how prisons are built, the people inside are abandoned. Like they're only allowed to be seen X amount a day, only allowed, to see daylight X amount a day. And because of that, they are low key abandoned. They're only forced to be seen when they want to be seen, when they're allowed to be seen, and they're forced to do whatever the jail wants to do with them. And the divestment part is like what she is saying, it's like, it's abandonment on both sides. So as a divestment in the communities, it's able to have this capitalist country, imprison these people and make them basically modern slaves.
Yeah, and it's that abandonment even before they get benefits too. Saying that we're not giving those services that we need to give, the state and the government. Welfare being one of those examples. And so the gap is filled by prisons. And instead of solving those problems, then instead of solving the problems at the beginning, we're letting those problems play out and then trying to solve them inadequately at the end with prisons.
I want to say that it's attempting to solve a problem though. Like she was saying earlier, that's just like putting them away.
Right.
Versus, and like if they were actually even attempting to solve an issue, then they wouldn't do what they're doing. So I don't think that the prison industrial complex is like meant to solve anything. I think it's meant to be punitive and work for capitalism at this point. I really do. California, prisoners in California are fighting wildfires for 13 cents an hour. My uncle did that when he was in prison, and it's horrific. Next thing you know, they'll be like, let's send them overseas for the next war. Like, that is not humane. This does not make sense. And not giving them, if the best option for you in prison is to make 13 cents an hour, like risking your life
for rich people in California. That sucks. It's horrible.
Yep.
We're living in hell here.
It is frightening. So if we look then more specifically at what has happened in state and municipal budgets, we see the expansion of budgets devoted to mass incarceration, to jails, and to police. We see not only that, but in agencies that are supposed to be working toward other ends, education, health, and so forth, a rise in police functions. One thing that we see happening, for example, is that police in schools has spread across the United States in this period. Or we can look at something as relatively technical and one would imagine benign as student financial aid. And we see that student financial aid officers in colleges and universities have a policing function as well. Or the fact that the United States Department of Education has a SWAT team. So we see that the policing function has risen not only in the traditional agencies of the police, that is, say, police, jail, and prison, but also in social welfare agencies. And so it's that twinned growth that shows us that we've been so thoroughly abandoned that we have to take back. We have to take back, which is to change, transform, and move to something new.
As government and corporate leaders across the United States facilitate divestment that is sanitized in the deceptive language of cost savings and shared sacrifice, Ruthie understands why some communities also begin to look to prisons for other reasons. California Assemblyman Jim Costa used these false promises about prisons as a way to supercharge his political career. He put 3 prisons in his district in the 1980s and sponsored 3 more in the 1990s. Ruthie describes this by saying that he climbed the punishment ladder into the California State Senate.
When we were fighting for many, many years to stop California from building its and opening its, I think it would have been the 24th new prison it would have constructed and opened over about a 23-year period, we did enormous outreach to the city of Delano, the town where that prison was to have been built.
Delano provided a stark example of the difference in priorities between 2 different kinds of solutions. Costa responded to unemployment with the promise of jobs, which would ostensibly be created by locking people in cages. Another solution, grounded in Delano's history, responded to exploitation with solidarity and collective struggle.
Delano is a central place in the imagination of agricultural workers throughout the United States because it's where the headquarters of the United Farm Workers was. The United Farm Workers that came out of organizing that was mostly dominated in the early days by Filipino migrant workers, but eventually became strongly associated with Mexican American, which is say Chicano workers, and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta are the names most strongly associated with that organization, that union, and that movement. The UFW's headquarters was at a place in Delano called 40 Acres. Why was it called 40 Acres? 40 Acres was named in solidarity and honor with the agricultural workers of the US South, the free people to whom General Sherman had in his field order promised they would be granted 40 acres and a mule so that they could be self-sufficient in the wake of the US Civil War. So imagine this. In this small place, small town, city of Delano, there was already one mega prison, thousands of people, a small prison with about 500, and the plan for a new mega prison designed for 5,160 people slated to be built. I did research, combed through every possible document to try to figure out how many of the projected 1,800 jobs would likely go to residents of the city of Delano. And the biggest number I could come up with was 72 out of 1,800 jobs, 72. So I told a reporter for the New York Times, a woman called Evelyn Yevis, what I had found in my research. And she repeated this to the then mayor of Delano. This was 20 years ago. She repeated what I had said to him. And he said, well, you gotta understand, things here are so bad. I cannot, as the mayor of this town, say, we don't need those 72 jobs. Some people tried to tell us that this was peculiar somehow to California and other places, towns and other parts of the United States were just benefiting enormously by having lockups in their communities. But the more that I and some of my colleagues and comrades studied the problem, going to places like North Carolina and Minnesota and Pennsylvania, to Texas and Oklahoma, to Oregon and beyond, was it wasn't true. It wasn't true that the lockups provided what people wanted, even if the lockups provided something that people were afraid of letting go. Those are two different things. That's what organized abandonment has done to our political imagination, to our expectation of what kinds of opportunities and protections should be available and accessible to people, modestly educated people in the prime of life. Modestly educated people in the prime of life are the people who are locked in prison, and they are the people who work in prison. They are two sides of the same coin. Those who have suffered organized abandonment and those who labor in the area of organized violence to keep steady the otherwise explosive conditions that people are living through. And that kind of brings us to today. Nobody predicted the pandemic. I mean, in general, people like Mike Davis say it's coming, but nobody knew that eventually something was going to happen that would unsettle all of the uneasy relations between and among people who experience abandonment and those whose job it is to control the effects of that abandonment until the pandemic. And I do think it's that objective condition, the condition of people having been told to stay home, the condition of at least 20% unemployment, which means it's higher throughout the United States, people tired of the ongoing relentless assaults on people going about their everyday lives by police, sick of police killings, sick that has produced the conditions that cause us to be invited by Jeremy Scahill to have this conversation.
Okay, this is the last time we're going to stop before we finish it up. What do y'all think about that idea that the people who are in the prisons and the people who are employed by the prisons are two sides of the same coin, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says? So take a minute. Are there any questions about that question before we start then? Okay, so take a minute, go ahead and share with your partner, 30 seconds each.
I mean, the comfort, I've done medical and to understand, because I haven't said the system.
Go ahead and switch if you haven't already.
Oh, that's right.
All right, bring it back in 5, 4, 3, 2. Anybody want to share a full group? Would you agree that they're two sides of the same coin, or would you just? Okay, let's just sit with that one.
They
And then-
can't exist without each other, so.
I do get the coin part though, like the metaphor of it, because like on one side of the being tails, it's like the prisoners. You know, like they're the ones being affected by the switch of the pandemic, and they're not being treated like they should be treated. And the heads part with the system, it's like I don't like them, you know, because of what they're enforcing and stuff like that. But at the same time, I can't get mad at them because like they're still doing what they're being told to do. You know, they're taking care.
Can you be mad at cops then? What's the difference?
Because like the difference is like with the cops is it's like they already have like this egotistical self about themselves, you know, and then with the correctional officers that are inside or anything like that, you know what I mean? Like I believe like we can't get guided until the system changes. You know what I mean?
But you don't feel that way about police. You don't feel that same way about police officers.
I'm mad at the system and the police officers. Because the police officers, I mean, like the police officers we have today, like this systematic racism has been in place, like she said, for 150 years. You know, until we reform what they're employed to do, it's like it's them. But sometimes, but there is some officers who do take that as an egotistical standpoint and will use it to their advantage. That's like that type of thing. It's like a contradictory part type of thing.
It's also a different car driver.
No, I was just gonna mention, so I have a friend that was working for a prison in Arizona. He still works there. And his thing was, we were talking about it, and I was asking him his experience, and he mentioned that he's gotten along with most of the prisoners, and he felt like he's like, yeah, they're all like really nice people, and I think a lot of people going into these jobs have already dehumanized the people inside. So for them, it's like difficult to even understand them as people. So that's kind of like I think the difference between like cop, like correctional officer.
Yeah.
There's a big difference because a lot of people that are already in prison and work for prisons, they've already looked at these people as like less. Whereas like we're normal civilians, we're free people, but we're treated almost the same way.
I think kind of tying in with the three of you, for me, I struggle to empathize with prison employees. I do see them similar to the police force, most specifically correctional officers. I know specifically working with the prison population was one of my first loves when I got into social work and actually applied to work at a prison and I got offered the position. My first day there was basically like a tour and an introduction to the rules, and that was the day that I quit because I was basically told I couldn't treat them like humans. I wasn't allowed to look at them. I wasn't allowed to make eye contact. I wasn't allowed to say hi. It was Thanksgiving that day, and everybody was saying like Happy Thanksgiving, and I wasn't allowed to respond to that. And to me, especially as a social worker, the one that I was going to be doing therapy with, like I'm going to be doing therapy with you. That's a very intimate relationship, but I'm not even allowed to make eye contact with you. So that just showed me like it was systematic within the prison system as well, and I couldn't get with that.
I personally think that they're the same, like police and correctional officers. It's the same, like authority figure, and then someone below them that they're supposed to keep in line or enforce things upon. I mean, Rick made a good point, but I don't know. I just think for me personally, without trying to be rude or anything, I think anytime we say like, well, it's their job, like they have, like they're told to do that. It's like a lot of people have been told to do things that they were definitely immoral or wrong, like, and I don't think it's different for correctional officers or police officers. It's like the same deal. Like, it's depending on how that person acts. But regardless of how that person acts on an individual level, they are still part of the system that is immoral and wrong and punitive versus rehabilitating. Rehabilitative?
Yeah, not to defend, but something to point out from the context here is the argument that Ruth Wilson Gilmore is making is that these prisons are opening up in small towns to the point where not only is the prisoner being exploited, but also the people who are being employed by the prisons are being exploited as well, because they're being dragged into that system that's being trained that way and trained to dehumanize people, but also they're being dragged in because, like that mayor said, they were so desperate that they were willing to take that prison for only 72 jobs. And so that idea that not only are people pushed to think, oh, well, prisons are good because they create jobs, but then also pushing people to be like, okay, well, I have no other option but to work in this prison. And so it's exploiting their labor as well,
Yeah,
because it's
that's
taking
true.
advantage of these small towns where they have no other options.
That's true.
Isn't part of the police training to actually stay as a prison guard for a certain amount of time before going out into the streets?
For police officers?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
It's like,
It might be like some others, I don't think I know that. My friend, when he was trying to apply for Metro, they had to do a couple things, just like the basic stuff, but the hours that he was like requested to do in the city wasn't even anything crazy. And going back to like, I think someone mentioned something about like domestic abuse or domestic violence and being a police officer. I had a conversation with my friend who applied for Metro last year, and he said, because I said most cops are prone to be violent people, and I brought the fact of domestic violence. He was like, no, he's like, everyone takes a polygraph test, and you have to pass like everything, and everything has to be like legit. Like, you domestic, or you have any domestic violence cases or anything related to that, you probably wouldn't be hired for it. But then I told him that a lot of people have like a different perception when it comes to domestic violence and domestic abuse. And like the idea of a lot of people can pass the polygraph test because they don't understand what domestic violence is when it comes to mental abuse. And he's like, no, but if you're not hitting the person, you're okay. And I was like, I don't fucking know about that. Like, I said, no, well, I know.
No, that makes sense.
But he swears that like every cop that's hired by Metro is like a good person. I was like,
We're just good at lying.
I don't know about
We
that.
lost one. We lost
Well,
one.
if you don't think you're doing anything wrong, then you're not lying on the test.
That too, like the polygraph is the easiest thing to do, like kind of.
it's not even
It's not even
real
using-
science.
Yeah.
Yeah, polygraphs aren't even, they're like admissible in court.
We digress.
Okay, just a heads up, since we started late, it is 7:58. For people to keep in mind for time, and also thanks for the space, just to ask, we have about 15 minutes left in the podcast.
Be invited by Jeremy Scahill to have this conversation.
That was Ruth Wilson Gilmore in this special episode, Intercepted. We'll get back to the interview in a moment, but first, I wanted to take some time for a grounding exercise. A grounding exercise is a technique that helps us to use our five senses to become present and move through states of distress or mounting anxiety. The following poem by Greensboro artist and organizer Demetrius Noble is entitled Poverty, Policing, Pandemic, a Black Lives Matter grounding exercise.
Inhale. Smell that righteous rage permeating from police precincts, propane with protests. I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, but I need you to pull your face mask down and smell the swell of 100,000 yells. No justice, no peace. You can literally smell the fire of our legitimate political desires whenever wind blows. You tried to hide inside, but the revolutionary aroma rolled in through busted windows. They found some rich rapping Negroes the denigrating the dark denizens who dared to remind Atlanta's black mayor that they too are citizens and are tired of living in poverty in the city that leads the nation in income inequality. With Black Lives Matter on their minds and the radical inflection point within reach, these outcasts hit the streets and told Mayor Bottoms, fuck your new Atlanta compromise speech. In hell, can you smell the fear of orange monsters cringing in bunkers? See the actions of neo-fascists dispatching troops on unruly youngsters, tear gassing our children because they have the audacity to believe that another world is possible and won't stop until it's achieved. Smell the winds of change riding in on this new breed. Not even your offensive line can block freedom's fragrance, Drew Brees. See established budgets crumbling from our rumblings as we demand defund the police. See charges being filed as brilliant red fires glow. Hear the chant Black Lives Matter as global protests grow. Hear essential workers on a picket line scream, no, we won't go. Feel this mighty movement from below. Witness that this powder keg is about to blow. Take off your face mask, open your mouth and belt suppress screams. Inhale and smell the city's on fire till you taste the kerosene. Say their names until you can taste our pain. Then join us on the front lines as we struggle for change. Don't let these embers cool, youngin'. Feed the flame.
Last week, after police officers in Minneapolis were charged, some people wondered why protesters and organizers were still in the streets. Of course, many different kinds of folks are in the streets for many different reasons. Princeton professor Keeanga Yamada Taylor has pointed out that although Black folks are oppressed in many different areas of our lives, such as housing, healthcare, and food security, police brutality and state violence are consistently the match that lights the fire of broader rebellion. Ruth Wilson Gilmore takes up similar issues as she discusses the events leading up to the Watts Rebellion in 1965.
From the mid-1960s until now, if we look at kind of grand indicators, one of the things that we see is a decline in union membership in the manufacturing trades. In public sector unions, a little bit less so, and in fact, a certain amount of success up until the early 90s. We see that at the moment that the civil rights movement, or what some of us like to call Second Reconstruction, was reaching its apogee with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65, both of which the current United States Supreme Court is gutting. We see that the economic well-being already of vulnerable communities in urban and rural contexts were already under fire. In the Watts context, I do not dispute that people came out in the streets because one too many people had been dragged out of his car and brutalized by the cops in Watts. That is true. But it is also true that Watts was already experiencing, Watts writ large, was already experiencing what became much more the norm 10 years later, which is what I have been terming the organized abandonment of vulnerable communities, that jobs were leaving, that protections were leaving, that opportunities for advancement and protections from calamity were going away. So in the early mid-1970s, we see in the long wind down of the Vietnam War, in the big buildup of quote unquote law and order under Nixon, before Nixon's own law breaking ran him out of office, we see what the political economists Bennett Harrison and Barry Bluestone called the Great U-turn. And the Great U-turn is the turn away from expanded unionization, expanded jobs, benefits, workplace protections, and the removal bit by bit of, especially but not exclusively, manufacturing jobs from high wage, high union states in the United States to either low wage, quote unquote, right to work states or overseas. And both of those movements happened. They call that the Great U-turn. So the Watts riot was an expression of frustration and abandonment. And at the same time, I want to talk about schools for a moment. The school discipline policy in Los Angeles had shifted quite dramatically from what it had been up until the passage of Brown versus Board of Education in the mid-50s, in which school principals decided on discipline, and suspension and much less expulsion were very rare, to a centralized school discipline policy that required suspension and expulsion, required it. So there were all kinds of destabilization of already struggling communities throughout the levels of age, education, and so forth, including school discipline policies that then, resulted in young people's frustration with every aspect of their lives, short-term and perspective as well.
The multifaceted rebellions that explode from long histories of exploitation and domestic colonialism raise an important issue. As Kathy Cohen put it in a recent episode of the Dig podcast, what does justice for George Floyd really mean? Ruthie offered some insight into that question.
The last story I want to leave you with, a story of the amazing late, great Michael Zinser, who was a member of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, who fought against cops and cop brutality throughout Southern California, where he was quite the organizer and political leader. Michael Zinser, in a brutal attack on him by, I think it was Pasadena police force, lost an eye. And quite amazingly, in those days, he brought suit and was compensated for this harm that happened to him. And he took those resources and founded an organization that he then ran through the rest of his life, the Coalition Against Police Abuse, CAPA. Now, running the coalition out of a little tiny office with uncomfortable folding chairs in South Central LA, Michael paid attention to all of the things that were going on around him. He didn't only look at the cops. He asked himself questions that I asked myself, and I've been encouraging people who are listening to us today to ask themselves, what is it that makes people's lives vulnerable? What is it that makes people's lives vulnerable? And as you might know, I, Ruthie, have defined racism as the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. It's a mouthful, but I'm going to make it clear in the next few minutes. Michael Zinser thought very hard about the fact that so many young people who were growing up in housing projects in Los Angeles were suffering from really bad asthma, very bad asthma. And in fact, kids were dying of asthma. Nobody should die of asthma. It's eminently treatable. And they were suffering and dying of asthma. And so he looked into what it was that was creating the conditions for such relentless rates of asthma in the public housing projects and in regions of low-income, working-class people in Southern California. And he saw that one of the problems that people were facing was that since the maintenance of that public housing was so dismal, the incidence of vermin infestation, mice, rats, and roaches, and also mold was creating it literally an atmosphere conducive to asthma because of the roach droppings, mouse droppings, and the occasional or regular use of pesticides and to deal with roaches. That all of this was contributing to the incidence of asthma. That means that Michael Zinston became an environmental justice activist because he was an anti-police activist, right? He was against the police because police were shortening lives. He became an environmental justice activist because in the environment within the living spaces for these young people was literally killing them. And so he became, as it were, a model for what I imagine abolition to be today. That is to say, abolition has to be green. It has to take seriously the problem of environmental harm, environmental racism, and environmental degradation. To be green, it has to be red. It has to figure out ways to generalize the resources needed for well-being for the most vulnerable people in our community, which then will extend to all people. And to do that, to be green and red, it has to be international. It has to stretch across borders so that we can consolidate our strength, our experience, and our vision for a better world. So that's what I came to say to you about abolition today.
Ooh, oh my God. Thank you, Ruth Wilson Gilmore.
It's great to have been in conversation with you today.
That was part one of our conversation with legendary geographer and prison abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Part two will include her reflections on how contemporary defunding campaigns connect to the broader abolition struggle. And she'll also explore some of the obstacles to police accountability. You don't want to miss it.
Good stuff.
Any final thoughts? All right.
Not really like the police.
Often eye contact.
What's that?
Police in general, not like.
Yeah, not bad, not bad.
Sounded like people shouldn't be racist.
I've always thought that was kind of bad.
It's really turning me to the other side.
Well, thank you all for having this discussion today. Next week, I was thinking about talking about environmental racism, as
Ooh, my favorite.
kind of left off on that, environmental injustices. But also, are there any topics that anybody would be interested in discussing? That way it's not just,
Racism in healthcare.
Okay.
Yeah.
I see this stuff before.
racism in healthcare, anything else? Any big topics anybody wants to explore more as a group? Or just learn about in general?
End game of abolition.
Thank you, yeah. And if you think of anything, also, please let me know. I don't want to just be, here you go, here you go, here you go, all the time, so.
We love it.
Well, thank you all very much. Hope you have a wonderful
you.
rest.
Thank you.
I'm gonna put myself up real quick.